Enough is enough. Go home and stay home. This is what we all need to be doing. And we're going to make sure this happens, whether by educating people more on the risks or by enforcing the rules, if that's needed.
It is as close as the Prime Minister has come to saying he's ready to take the next step. Socializing, hanging out on beaches and in parks is not okay. Anyone who does it risks spreading the virus. Ignore it, and strict limits could be imposed on your personal freedom. Good evening and thanks for joining us. We begin with new insight into some extraordinary measures the government is proposing to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic. Global News has learned the federal government is poised to table a bill granting it sweeping new powers to spend money and raise taxes without having to get the approval of Parliament. Meanwhile, some provinces are putting tougher measures in place already to try to slow the spread. Ontario and Quebec are shutting down all non-essential businesses. Only pharmacies, grocery stores, and a few other services will remain open. We'll get to all that in just a moment, but first, a status report on the numbers everyone is watching. Positive cases of COVID-19 have now surged past 2,000 in Canada. BC, Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec are hardest hit. Together, they account for more than 90% of all confirmed cases, though every province and territory except Nunavut now has detected the virus. To give you a sense of how rapidly this pandemic is accelerating here, in the span of 3 days, the number of confirmed cases in Canada has more than doubled. Parliament is being recalled to pass urgent legislation in response to COVID-19. David Aiken has breaking news about that. David, Global News has learned the government is proposing legislation that will give it extraordinary powers for quite some time. What can you tell us?
Right. Well, this legislation had been telegraphed last week, Donna, as pretty much pro forma stuff, going to formalize the $27 billion relief package announced last week, a relief package that was going to enhance EI benefits and enhance Canada Child benefits. But there may be some additional hiccups. Global News has been briefed on some of the contents of the legislation that the Trudeau minority government will put before the House tomorrow. One section of the legislation would give Finance Minister Bill Morneau special powers to raise taxes, lower taxes, and change existing tax law, all without Parliament's approval, either before the fact or after the fact. Not only that, Morneau would have this extraordinary power until December 2021. Now, we asked the Finance Minister's office to comment on this legislation, and what we heard from Bill Morneau's spokespeople was essentially that they're not going to comment until the legislation is actually tabled in the House on Tuesday. And they say they're working with all parties to see this legislation through. But this is a minority government that is essentially asking for a blank check to borrow, tax, and spend for the next 18 months without parliamentary approval. I can tell you that the opposition parties, all of them, were surprised when they saw the text of this legislation today. Surprise is an understatement, perhaps, and they're all very anxious about giving Morneau these new powers. And so what do? They are going to strategize overnight about this. They do have more combined votes in the government. Do they amend the legislation? Do they defeat it? That's what they'll have to discover. But Donna, just to sum up how historic this is, even in the First World War and the Second World War, no finance minister asked or got these kind of powers because, of course, Parliament was able to sit all through those crises, those national emergencies, and vote on legislation. And I'm sure the Liberals tomorrow will be saying they need some of these big powers because for the first time in our history, we may have to limit Parliament's ability to meet because of this public health crisis. Donna.
Absolutely extraordinary times and so much on the line. David, thank you. Let's go to our Ottawa Bureau Chief, Mercedes Stevenson. Mercedes, can you give us some context here on what this legislation might mean?
Well, Donna, it basically means that the finance minister can tax and spend, if this goes ahead, until December of 2021 without having to seek the authority of Parliament. And basically, the most important function that Parliament has is to approve things like taxation and spending of government money. Historically, through Westminster democracy, that has really been a focal point. The idea that you don't have taxation without representation. It's particularly remarkable in this case because it's a minority government that is asking for these powers that, as David said, are absolutely unprecedented. Even during times of world wars, you didn't have finance ministers who had the ability to circumvent Parliament to make decisions about government spending, raising or lowering lowering taxes without having to seek the consent of elected officials. The fact it goes until December of 2021 is also remarkable. And right now, the opposition is trying to figure out what to do with this. They weren't expecting it, and they're frustrated trying to decide how to work with the government because they do want to make sure that people are able to get the resources they need, the same goal that the government has said that they have, but they feel that this ask goes too far in many cases and it sets potentially a dangerous precedent. So it'll be very interesting to hear how the government defends why they're asking for something so extraordinary. And it's also raising questions for some MPs, Donna, about whether Parliament can do some of its work in another way, either with minimum staffing, from social distancing, or from home. They're saying that every other industry is learning to adapt to the new normal. Perhaps Parliament should too, instead of simply suspending, sitting, and making democratic decisions.
All right, Mercedes Stephenson, thanks. The Prime Minister's message to Canadians today is behave as if you have the virus and don't do anything that risks spreading it. Mike LeCouture on Prime Minister Trudeau's tough talk and what it means for you.
Listening is your duty, and staying home is your way to serve.
Practically pleading with people, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's message to Canadians: your cooperation is key to limiting the spread of COVID-19. And despite weeks of repeating that, the government clearly didn't get through to hundreds of people in BC this past weekend.
When we see images of people out enjoying the sunshine in large groups, that is extremely concerning because they are not just putting themselves at risk, they are putting everyone else at risk.
Trudeau still says nothing is off the table when it comes to forcing people to stay inside, including the Emergencies Act. And the Deputy Prime Minister says they will consult premiers about it during a conference call Monday evening.
Getting a clear sense of both what the situation is across the country and where the premiers feel they do or do not have the necessary tools in their own provincial and territorial toolboxes.
Monday, the premiers of Quebec and Ontario brought down the hammer. François Legault closing all non-essential businesses at midnight Tuesday as his province saw a massive jump in the number of COVID-19 cases.
We must put Quebec on pause until Easter for a possible restart on April 13.
Premier Ford is doing the same, but only for 2 weeks. And like in Quebec, both grocery stores and pharmacies will remain open. Ford feels the time to act is now.
Our resources are spread thin. We want to focus on making sure we flatten this curve and contain the spread.
Aiming to do the same, the federal government has earmarked $192 million of the billion-dollar COVID-19 response fund for research and development of a Canadian vaccine for the virus. Trudeau points out it will take months to develop a vaccine, so while that work is ongoing, he wants Canadians to do their part by staying apart. Donna?
Mike LeCouture in Ottawa, thanks. Well, there are thousands of people across this country right now bracing for what's coming. They're the medical staff who are already treating those who are ill with COVID-19 and those who are waiting. They all look to Italy and Spain and elsewhere, wondering, what if that happens here? Will we be able to save lives and have enough personal protection equipment to save ourselves? Abigail Beeman is looking into that tonight.
Global News obtained an email to staff at Lakeridge Health announcing the Ontario hospital is cancelling all surgeries with the exception of life and limb, saying the main reason to cancel is shortage of personal protective equipment.
We want everyone to know that we have adequate supplies.
The head of the Canadian Medical Association says otherwise, hearing from doctors nationwide.
They are worried that there is insufficient number of ventilators and an inadequate supply of personal protective equipment across the country.
5 days ago, pharmacists pleaded to be recognized as essential healthcare providers in terms of supply.
Pharmacies across the country are now putting up plexiglass around their dispensaries and plastic screens, but there is a definite, lack of supply of being able to get things like masks, gloves, other things like that.
The federal health minister was more specific.
I can say that we have enough PPEs for the next week or two.
Patty Haidu urging hospitals facing shortages to talk to their provincial ministry.
We're working very closely with all of the provincial and territorial ministers of health to make sure that we understand what we have and how we can allocate it to meet very specific needs in very specific regions.
Former Health Minister Dr. Jane Philpott has joined the front lines, working at a COVID-19 assessment centre trailer at Markham Stouffville Hospital.
We actually have a special tent outside with a nurse who's wearing full protective equipment that's doing the swabs.
While companies rush to help.
It integrates the functions of a ventilator, generating its own oxygen from the air.
Toronto's Thornhill Medical with a self-contained ventilator, Ottawa's Spartan Bioscience with a quick test.
You put that into our device, then you hit go, and then in 30 minutes it gives you your results.
Okay.
Both among the company's promised federal funding, both waiting for further instruction before they can ramp up supply. Abigail Beeman, Global News, Ottawa.
We know you have lots of questions about this virus. Our Jeff Semple will continue to consult with experts and try to answer them. Email your questions at globalnews.ca, and our website also has a special page dedicated entirely to COVID-19. You can visit globalnews.ca/coronavirus.